Let's talk about babies. Those big eyes, adorable chubby cheeks, fantastic brains. No, really. We've talked quite a bit over the years about the psychology of the tiniest humans and what we know about their brains and our brains when we raise them. They're just full of surprises. Let's start with their heads, because babies are smart. Yeah, I know they don't know their cheese crackers from the magazine you're reading and think both are tasty snacks, but their brains are working overtime figuring out how to brain. Let me explain. You might think that babies don't do much besides eat and poop, and maybe that's kind of true. But before they can talk or walk, infants start to do all sorts of cognitive feats that seem awfully smart for a baby. Inside their little brains, there's a lot more going on than you might expect. In the first 3 months of a child's life, their brain nearly doubles in size, and it continues to grow at breakneck speed until they're 3. But what all that new brain matter is doing is a little harder to determine. You can't ask babies to solve puzzles or tell you what they're thinking, so researchers have had to get pretty creative to study infant cognition. They can examine what infants do, for example, like what behaviors they choose to imitate, or which people or objects they interact with. And even before they can move around or make gestures, scientists can use the violation of expectation paradigm to peer into babies' minds. Put simply, infants look differently at things that are surprising or unexpected. So by measuring how long they stare at different scenarios or how their pupils change while they stare, scientists can generally tell what the baby thought would happen. Researchers can also use high-tech brain imaging techniques like functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, which looks at blood flow to determine which brain areas are most active, or electroencephalography, or EEG, which measures the electrical patterns generated by brain cells firing. And by using some or all of these methods, psychologists have discovered infants have a lot going on in those tiny little noggins. Infants as young as 9 months old seem to do simple math, for instance. In a 2004 violation of expectation study, babies watched a movie where 5 objects fell behind a wall, followed shortly by 5 more. Then the wall moved off screen, revealing either 5 objects, the wrong answer, or 10 objects, the right answer. The baby stared longer at the screen when only 5 were revealed, suggesting that they knew that 5 plus 5 should equal more than 5. Similar studies have shown that infants as young as 2 months seem to have a rudimentary grasp of physics. At that age, they know where a moving object should end up, even if it goes behind a barrier. By 4 to 5 months, they expect unsupported objects to fall rather than hover, suggesting that they are aware of the phenomenon of gravity. And at 7 months, they'll look longer at a ball that rolls up a hill than a ball that rolls down it. Babies even seem to recognize differences between the states of matter. In experiments, they seem to expect liquids to flow through a grate and expect solids to stay on top. All this makes sense because to survive as adults, humans need to learn about the properties of the physical world around them. And babies sure get lots of time to study how things behave, since they can't, do much else. Young humans also need to learn the unspoken rules of human society and develop an understanding of things like emotion, language, and cooperation. And that learning starts early too. Most infants seem to pick up on emotions really early on, for example. When scientists scanned the brains of 3 to 7-month-olds while they listened to emotional voices, they found that sad voices produce more activation in brain regions which are important for emotion processing, like the insula. And well before they say their first words, babies seem to be laying down the foundations for understanding language. Even at 3 or 4 months old, studies suggest babies use novel words that they hear as a way to categorize objects, an effect that does not occur when they hear a simple tone instead. And they seem to recognize and value certain social traits like collaboration. In a 2007 study, 6 to 10-month-olds chose to reach towards a character that helped another character climb up a hill, rather than one that pushed others down, indicating that they understood and preferred cooperative or pro-social behavior. There's even some evidence babies can get inside other people's heads. Even though infants aren't generally considered to have theory of mind, the perception that other people have their own unique set of thoughts, feelings, and beliefs, they do seem to make basic inferences about why other people do what they do. For example, in one study, researchers had 14-month-old infants watch as an adult turned on a light with her head. The woman either had her hands free or pretended to be cold and wrapped herself in a blanket, which prevented her from using her hands as normal. When her hands were occupied, the babies were less likely to imitate her and instead turned the light on with their hands. But when her hands were free, they followed her lead, turning the light on with their heads too. It was as if they understood that if her hands were occupied, she was turning the light on in a strange way because she was unable to use her hands. But if her hands were free, then she used her head because, for some reason, that was the best way to do it. So even though it seems like they're not doing much, long before babies can talk or even walk, they're learning a lot about the world around them every day. And that's probably why it seems like they grow up all too fast. I guess it makes sense they're quick studies. They have to be. There's a ton you need to know when it comes to being a fully grown human person, and they're taking a lot of cues from us. They're always watching the adults in their lives and learning how to communicate with them. Generally, those adults are their caregivers, but sometimes they can be complete strangers. Yes, that baby staring at you in line at the grocery store is learning. Here's the deal. So you're in line at the grocery store, and there's a parent holding a baby right in front of you. You're minding your own business, but when you look up, that baby just won't stop staring at you, like you're the most interesting thing on the planet. You might feel like you've grown a second head, or like you have chocolate smeared all over your mouth, but in reality, that baby just likes looking at your face, because there's a lot to figure out there. From very early in life, babies seem to like looking at faces, or even just configurations of shapes that look like faces. They also prefer faces they recognize to ones they don't, but they'll sometimes spend a little more time looking at strangers because they're new or different. Faces are important to babies because they're basically completely helpless and have to rely on their caregivers to survive. They need to be able to find and communicate with the people who feed them and change their diapers, and knowing what they look like is an important part of that, even if said communication just involves screaming at the top of their lungs for a while. Babies are also busy taking in huge amounts of information to help them understand the world, and faces can teach them a lot. From our expressions to how our mouths form words, a lot of our communication as humans happens through our faces. In those first few months of life, babies are not only beginning to learn how to recognize their parents or grandparents, but also about all the emotions conveyed by facial expressions. There's a lot to learn. So when a baby is staring at you in a grocery store, her little brain is probably trying to figure out if she knows you and what categories your face fits into, like if you're happy or sad. Now, babies might be born ready to learn from the world around them, but there's still some question about whether looking at faces is an innate characteristic, one you're born with, or if it's influenced by experience. And, like a lot of the age-old nature versus nurture debate, it's a little bit of both. On the nature side, there's some evidence that, within hours to days of being born, babies can copy facial expressions they see, like if you stick out your tongue at them. Not all studies agree with those results, but it's possible that there's an innate ability for finding and mimicking expressions. Other research has found that within hours of birth, babies can discriminate between their mother's face and a stranger's, which might mean their brain is ready to recognize faces without much information. So some evidence suggests that babies may be predisposed to look for information from faces right when they're born. But other studies have shown that it takes experience to get really good at it. Either way, all the time babies and their caregivers spend looking at each other causes rapid improvement in babies' ability to process and recognize faces. Starting around 3 months old, they even begin to group different kinds of faces, like human versus animals and kids versus adults. One especially cool study had babies and adults look at a series of different monkey faces, and also at a bunch of different adult human faces. They found that 6-month-old babies are actually better at differentiating between monkey faces than adults are. But when they're about 9 months old, that ability goes away because of what's called perceptual narrowing, where their perception starts to change based on their experience. Basically, the baby learns that paying attention to the differences in human faces is way more important for its life than the differences in monkey faces, so it should focus more on humans than monkeys. As the brain develops over time, the pathways used to recognize human faces get more efficient, and the ones for monkeys get pruned away. But when researchers expose babies to lots of monkey faces between when they're 6 and 9 months old, they effectively teach their brains that monkeys are important to pay attention to, so they keep that ability for a lot longer. Even though babies are born with some skills, experience helps tell them what parts of the world they should pay attention to, and that shapes how their brain's perception and recognition systems develop. So it's a little bit of nature and a little bit of nurture that goes into that cute, big-eyed baby staring at you. And yeah, in that moment, your face might just be the most interesting thing on the planet. But don't rule out the possibility that you might have a little chocolate on your face too. Do I? I don't, right? Like you guys would tell me if there's chocolate on my face? Stefan, Sam, am I good? But as babies are learning from us, they're shifting the way our adult brains work too. And it starts before they're even born. Not everyone who has a child experiences it the same way, but many people will have some form of pregnancy brain, a sort of memory fog that fades after the child is born. But that's okay. In fact, it may be a sign that your brain is preparing to care for your baby. Here's Hank to explain.
How good is your memory? Like, try to remember this list of words. Weather, snacks, cousin, cherry, floor, boats. Okay, can you repeat that back to me? Whether you're generally good at memorizing things or not, if you're pregnant or recently had a baby, this task might be a little trickier. That's because many pregnant people experience a foggy memory that can last for years after the pregnancy ends. This phenomenon has a number of names: momnesia, mom brain, baby brain, pregnancy brain, and memory loss only scratches the surface of what's going on. Turns out, to prepare for a baby, pregnancy actually remodels the human brain. Pregnancy brain is best known for causing memory loss, but studies show that it can also involve sleepiness or fatigue, dips in attention, and slower processing speeds. Pinning down the symptoms has been a challenge, partly because pregnancy can vary so much between people. For instance, those behavioral symptoms of pregnancy brain can start as early as the second trimester and last as long as 2 years after the baby's born. Or they can start as late as the third trimester and end just a few days after childbirth. Or there might be no symptoms at all. These variations can make it hard to get consistent experimental results. But a 2012 study compared 19 years of research and found that pregnancy brain is a real, measurable phenomenon that affects memory in a very specific way. With other kinds of memory loss, like amnesia, people have a complete inability to form new memories. But with pregnancy brain, it's harder to form certain types of memories. Specifically, memories that require effortful processing, like when you're actively trying to memorize information. So this includes memory tasks like free recall, where you remember a list of items or words one at a time. There's also delayed free recall, where you can remember information after some time or after a distraction, like whether you can remember the list from the beginning of this video. I know I can't. None of them. Boats. Was boat one of them? And then there's perspective memory, where you remember to do something in the future, like deciding to make mashed potatoes for dinner, and then you remember to stop at the store on the way home from work. It's unclear why these specific types of memory are affected, but we have some ideas as to how memory loss can happen because there are measurable changes in the brain. During pregnancy, brain changes are ultimately driven by sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, and prolactin. These hormone levels rise to super high concentrations during pregnancy and fluctuate a lot during the third trimester. As this happens, the amount of some neurotransmitters also changes, including a decrease in serotonin and dopamine and an increase in norepinephrine. That norepinephrine boost, which signals the fight or flight response, is also linked to an increased memory loss. And all these chemical brain changes play a role in physical changes during pregnancy, although scientists aren't entirely sure how everything's connected. See, researchers have found that pregnancy causes significant changes in gray matter, the regions where most neurons connect and talk to each other. An increase in gray matter volume can mean that an area needs to make more connections, while a decrease can mean there's some fine-tuning going on or a loss of information processing. But basically, changes in volume generally mean a shift in how the brain handles information. A 2016 study published in Nature Neuroscience looked at the brains of 25 women who got pregnant for the first time, before and after they gave birth. And they compared this MRI data to some scans of the brains of their male partners and the brains of women and men who didn't become new parents as controls. The researchers found that during pregnancy, the cortical midline, hippocampus, and areas of the prefrontal and temporal cortices had a significant loss of gray matter. And this decrease in volume had a correlation with memory loss, but it was also linked to an increase in sensitivity to emotional cues from the baby and emotional attachment. Specifically, there was a correlation between gray matter loss and higher marks on the maternal postnatal attachment scale, a 19-point questionnaire used to measure how well a biological mother bonds with her child. They also did a follow-up MRI scan on 11 of those new mothers and found that those brain changes can last at least 2 years after childbirth. And we're not sure how long it takes to get back to pre-pregnancy volumes of gray matter. But overall, pregnancy brain seems to be an evolutionary thing that helps the baby survive, kind of like how morning sickness is annoying, but it can offer protection from toxins. So meeting the demands of parenthood requires energy, time, patience, luck, and a little bit of brain remodeling.
It's weather, snacks, cousin, cherry, floor, boats. I remembered. But I don't need to tell you that having a baby is kind of a big life event. And the changes to our brains aren't limited to the one who actually gets pregnant. In fact, psychologists have documented differing effects on the brains of the parent who's literally having the kid and the one who isn't. And some of those differences can be illuminating. Here's Hank with more on, at least in his case, dad brain.
If you're not the one doing the whole pregnancy and labor thing, the physical changes you go through when your kid is born might not be as dramatic. But it's still pretty obvious when you become a parent. One might say that it's apparent. You get those dark circles under your eyes from the constant lack of sleep, not to mention your style might change a little bit. Goodbye, expensive duds, hello, spit up stained t-shirts and sweatpants. You might even find yourself with a more cuddly physique, the classic dad bod. But the changes on the outside are just the beginning. Your insides change a lot too, leading to what you might call dad brain, or even just parent brain. Tweaks to your brain tissues and hormones that prepare you to take better care of your kids. The changes that happen to parents who haven't just given birth have been harder to study because the animals we use in labs usually don't have both parents involved in childcare. Instead, researchers are mostly limited to looking at what's happening in people's brains using newer techniques like fMRI, which measures activity in different areas of the brain based on blood flow. And they've learned a lot in just the last few years. Before getting into that, though, it's worth noting that almost all of the research on this only looks at traditional families, a mother and a father both biologically related to the child, with the mother doing most of the caregiving. So for some of this, don't yet know exactly how it would apply to other types of families, like parents who adopt, or same-sex couples, or even parents who do equal amounts of childcare, which, like, maybe scientists should get on that. But based on what they've learned so far, it seems like a lot of the same brain-related changes that happen in parents who just gave birth also happen in parents who didn't. For example, we know that some areas of the brain tend to get bigger after childbirth. And a 2014 study in the journal Social Neuroscience found similar patterns in brains of new fathers from heterosexual couples. Using MRIs, the researchers looked at 16 new dads' brains and found that the size of certain areas increased in the first few months after their child was born. The areas that grew were involved in things like planning parental behaviors, responding to infant cues, and feeling good about attachment and bonding. So it's not just new moms whose brains grow in places that help you decide when your baby's next feeding should be, react to their cries, or feel all fuzzy when you're snuggling them. But there were also some changes unique to the new dads, areas of the brain that shrank. For example, they lost volume in places associated with daydreaming, because yes, neuroscientists have actually mapped the la-la land area of your brain. The team thinks this shrinkage might reflect the dad's increased vigilance in looking out for their helpless babies. Researchers did not see the same thing in a similar study of new moms, although that could be because pregnancy already changes the brain in a lot of ways, including shrinking these areas. The new dads also lost gray matter in areas involved in stress and anxiety, which might reflect settling into their role as a parent. That also didn't show up in new moms. Then there are the hormones. Studies have found that circulating levels of prolactin and oxytocin increased in new parents. Prolactin gets its name because it promotes lactation, so it makes sense that you would have higher levels if you're breastfeeding. But prolactin levels increase even in parents who aren't breastfeeding because it's responsible for so much more than just milk. It's considered the most versatile hormone in your body, and it regulates a lot of parental behaviors, to the point that it's sometimes just straight up called the parental hormone. Prolactin levels spike when parents interact with their kids, and studies have found that higher levels correlate with greater desire to calm a crying child. Oxytocin also plays an important role in forming bonds, including those between parents and kids, which is why you will sometimes see it nicknamed the love hormone. And some studies have found that when you spray doses of it into parents' noses, they become more playful and affectionate with their kids. But these hormones don't necessarily do the same thing in both parents. In studies of heterosexual couples, increases in oxytocin and prolactin have been associated with affectionate behaviors in moms like snuggling. In dads, on the other hand, they're associated with play behaviors, also a way to bond with a baby, but different from what's usually seen in moms. While all of this extra prolactin and oxytocin is running around, testosterone decreases. Testosterone is associated with sexual desire in both males and females, and when it decreases, so does libido, at least temporarily. So it's not just the lack of sleep that makes new parents less interested in sex. But overall, it's probably a good thing this happens, since researchers have found that dads with lower testosterone levels are more responsive to their baby's cues. Maybe because they're not thinking so much about making new babies. So it's not just pregnancy and labor that cause physiological changes that come with being a new parent. Instead, neuroscientists think it's actually behaving like a parent that affects your brain and hormones. It doesn't really matter whether you're a mom or a dad. Interacting with and caring for an infant reshapes your brain and your body in ways that help you be a better parent. Even if it feels like you have absolutely no idea what you're doing at first, evolution has prepared you for parenthood more than you think.
It's kind of amazing how evolution and culture together have made us pretty good at this whole kid-raising thing, right? Take baby talk, for example. You might think that all that cutesy gibberish would be no good for helping a child learn actual, grammar and stuff. But it occurs in all sorts of linguistic backgrounds, and researchers think it's how we introduce the most salient parts of our language to children. Let me fill you in. When we hear people using baby talk, most of us feel like we're not hearing what you might call a deep conversation. It's all high-pitched, sing-songy sounds and peekaboo and where'd the ball go and is that a kitty cat? It doesn't exactly sound like a TED Talk. But even though it sounds kinda silly, there is a reason that it starts coming out of our mouths as soon as we see those adorable chubby cheeks. Ask the internet or a parent from an older generation, and you might be told that using baby talk with kids is bad for them. They claim kids who hear baby talk won't have the opportunity to learn proper adult speech. But research actually suggests the opposite is true. Baby talk, known to scientists as infant-directed speech, really does seem to help babies with their language development. Infant-directed speech is the unique way of talking that we use with babies. It has that really recognizable tone and rhythm. Our voices go up in pitch, we use a wider range of pitches to sing-song through phrases, and it has slower, more exaggerated vowel sounds. The general term for these tonal and rhythmic elements of speech is known as prosody, and research shows the prosody of infant-directed speech can help with the baby's attention and language learning. We've known for a long time that babies pay more attention to higher-pitched voices. And in a study published in 2018, scientists suggested that infant-directed speech could be more attention-grabbing because it's less predictable than the speech we use with adults. But once we've got a baby's attention, baby talk's slower rhythm and exaggerated vowels might play another role. For example, a 2010 study showed pictures of things like cups or rabbits to 19-month-old infants. The babies were told, in a baby talky voice, to look at a specific picture. And the more baby talky the instructions were, the more likely the babies were to look at the right picture. The idea is basically that speaking this way helps babies split up an endless, featureless stream of sounds into chunks that have meaning. You know, words. And other research has shown that isolated words are easier to learn. All told, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that prosody really does make a difference in helping babies pay more attention to parental speech and gain linguistic skills. But prosody isn't the whole baby talk story. There's also discussion around whether infant-directed speech is grammatically simpler than adult speech. And this seems to be where some of the controversy comes in. Here's the thing. Infant-directed speech does have a lot of short phrases and sentences. And historically, researchers thought that this meant it was a simpler kind of input that let babies learn by using easier forms of language. But as researchers argued as far back as the 1980s, that doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. If baby talk is so simple, how do babies pick up on the more complex rules of grammar? That's probably what the people who tell you to speak properly to kids are getting at when they say baby talk is bad. But even if sentences of baby talk are shorter, they're very grammatically correct. While we might take shortcuts when it comes to speaking with other adults, the grammar we direct at kids is usually much more accurate. And infant-directed speech can actually model many different but overlapping grammatical structures, which provides complexity. This is why we say things like, "Where's the doggy?" and then follow it up with a bunch of other statements that basically rephrase the same idea, like, "Is that a doggy? Yes, that's a doggy. Let's pet the doggy." There are other debates about baby talk too, like whether cutesy words like choo-choo have any benefit. But when it comes to the prosody and grammar of baby talk, we probably don't have much to worry about. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that parents change the tone and emotional content of infant-directed speech as the baby gets older, which implies that as infants' developmental needs change, we naturally adjust our way of speaking to them. Baby talk is also a pretty universal phenomenon, which does seem to suggest that it's a normal part of infant development. Kids as young as 3 have been seen using this vocal pattern with babies. And while there's a lot of variation in how infant-directed speech sounds across cultures, most cultures do it. For instance, Cantonese and Japanese baby talk don't seem to have exaggerated vowels, but they do have changes in tone and rhythm that emphasize features of those languages. Scientific research might not be able to answer all of our questions about baby talk just yet, but the evidence mostly suggests that it's something we do naturally and something that our babies learn from. So don't worry about how it sounds. Your baby will be happy to hear it. Yes, it turns out this cute little voice is actually really helpful. But what about when we're introducing multiple languages? Well, the ability of bilingual children to pick up 2 languages at once tells us a lot about how their brains work, and just how flexible they are. So once more, let me explain how babies become bilingual. You know that feeling when you get tongue-tied and words just come out as a jumbled mess? Maybe you forget a word or have mushy grammar or your pronunciation is all wrong. There are a lot of things to keep track of. It seems like learning one language would be hard enough for babies, who already have trouble eating and not spitting up everywhere. But research has shown that infants are a lot more capable than you might think, especially when it comes to language. In fact, a lot of babies from bilingual families grow up fluent in both languages. Many psychologists think language is what's called an innate ability, or something we're born knowing how to do, like grasping objects and sucking on things. Classic cute baby stuff. So right from the start, babies are primed to learn a language. Any language. Most of us adults have trouble hearing subtle inflections in foreign languages. Like, if you only speak English, it might be hard for you to hear the difference between certain sounds in Thai or Russian. But in their first few months of being alive, babies can tell really similar sounds apart. To figure this out, lots of researchers have done studies where they pick a sound from a foreign language and play it on loop for babies around 4 months old. When the babies lose interest, the researchers switch to a new, similar sound. Usually, these really young infants notice the difference and perk up somehow, like by looking around or sucking harder on a pacifier. But if scientists repeat this experiment around 8 months later, 1-year-old babies typically ignore the second sound because they don't notice a difference. That's probably because as they get older, their brain cells make connections that help them focus on the sounds of their native language, and they get rid of unused connections related to recognizing other sounds. So, by the time an infant is 1 year old, its brain is already focusing on learning whatever language it's been exposed to most. And, surprisingly, babies don't need any special training to be bilingual, but they need equal exposure to both languages. Now, you might have heard that bilingual kids develop more slowly than their monolingual counterparts, or are more likely to have speech delays. But, according to the research, that's just not true. That even applies to babies who grow up with one spoken and one signed language, like English and American Sign Language. As they get older, these kids keep their languages separate thanks to their awesome perception skills. Just by watching faces and listening to verbal patterns, they're able to figure out when they should be speaking which language by around the time they're 3 years old. And when they intentionally switch from speaking one language to another, like talking to their friends in English, but to their mom in Cantonese, that's called code switching. Now, even though monolingual and bilingual babies develop at the same rate, one study from the University of Washington suggests that their brains process language a little differently. Psychologists use electroencephalograms, also known as EEGs, to detect electric brain activity in some 6-month-old monolingual and bilingual babies as they played recordings of speech sounds in English and Spanish. Babies in EEG caps? Super adorable. They found that monolingual babies caused a spike on the EEG whenever a mismatched sound popped up, like a Spanish sound thrown in among a bunch of English sounds or vice versa, which means they noticed a difference. But bilingual baby brains didn't notice when the languages switched. When the same babies were 10 to 12 months old, though, the results changed. The monolingual baby brains only responded when a sound in their native language interrupted a string of foreign sounds, but not the other way around. And the bilingual babies went from not noticing a difference to hearing both kinds of mismatches. According to the researchers, this means that monolingual baby brains seem to solidify connections faster to get ready to speak their primary language. But the bilingual baby brains stayed more flexible and didn't develop that wiring until later on. Turns out that this flexibility can have some developmental perks too. One study published in the journal Science found that bilingual babies may be better at learning rules and switching between them than monolingual babies. In the study, 1-year-old infants were taught that when they heard a certain pattern of sounds, they should look at a specific spot on a screen to see a fun toy. When the psychologist changed the pattern and moved the toy picture, the bilingual babies were better at figuring out the new rules and looking for the toy in the right places. Multiple studies suggest that bilingual adults have similar benefits, like better focus and ability to switch between tasks, and even less cognitive decline when they get older. But this doesn't mean all hope is lost if you're not bilingual. It's just one path a human brain can take. Our brains are really powerful, and even when you were a tiny, adorable baby, you were a lot smarter than you might think. If only picking up a second language was that easy for us grown-ups. And it's just one of the many ways baby brains are even more amazing than ours. Thanks for watching this extra special SciShow Psych compilation episode, including a compilation of my recent hair colors. If you'd like to keep watching, you might like our episode on how kids aren't as gullible as you think. And if you'd like to help support SciShow Psych, check out patreon.com/SciShow.